I'm not going to take up too much time, but I am going to introduce Julie. So again, my name is Carrie Morris. This is my voice that you're hearing. I am the VP of Client Services at Simplicity Consulting, and it is my pleasure to introduce Julie Schaller. She is no stranger to Simplicity Consulting. She actually was one of our very first employees on headquarters staff back in 2007, and she was also a longtime consultant in business and communications strategy after she left her FTE position at Xbox Retail as the chief of staff for that organization. But more importantly, Julie is doing some really amazing work, you guys. She is one of the co-founders for Empower Professional Coaching, and she's been doing this work since 2012. As a professional certified coach and a certified personal brand strategist, Julie has a proven track record for helping professionals design and land their ideal careers. We are thrilled and delighted to have Julie join us today as she teaches us how to break down communication barriers. This is one of the several sessions that Julie has generously volunteered to do for our company and our active team members. So again, I just want to say thank you so much, Julie, for your time. Everyone who's joining us today, and those of us who were unable to join but will receive the recording, I want you to know you can contact Julie directly for any coaching or just questions about what you're hearing today. We will be sharing the presentation and her contact information so that you can sign up and learn more, or just reach out to her directly. You can also find Julie's last training session where she talked about activating your network. That is all available. All of our trainings are available on our training and development page, which we'll share with you guys in the recap and when we share out the recording. So now I'm going to pass the microphone over to Julie Schaller. Thank you, Julie, for being with us today.
Thank you, Carrie, for that lovely introduction. That's so kind of you, and it's always really fun to come back to the Simplicity community. I feel like I'm coming home to my family, so it's really fun to be here. So thanks everyone for joining today. As you know, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about this whole area of communication barriers, which is so prevalent right now that we're all working over video or phone and nobody's back in the office. And it does cause a lot of extra stress and anxiety, or as I have listed here, virtual frustration. So we're going to dig into this a little bit and give you guys some tips and some insights on what you can do to help this area. So let me get my slides going here. So my promise today is 3 things. So first of all, it is my hope that you'll finish today with a greater understanding of your personality and communication preferences. And you will also learn the differences in others. So you know who you are, you'll be able to look at things from an opposite angle about how others might be different and have a framework for understanding that. And thus then how to best relate to your colleagues and friends. And I want to just take a moment on this just to give a nod to just sort of where we are with current events and all of the unrest that we're all experiencing. And so much of that unrest is because of such polar differences. And obviously, I'm not going to be talking about current events today, but I just want to point out that when we can understand the differences in each other, in this case, we're talking about communication, how much better that it helps us to relate to others. And then in your case, of course, do your best work. And third, I also want to help you have an understanding of how to overcome some of the most common communication challenges. So some of you sent in some questions and we'll address those. And I certainly hope that you'll walk away with some better understanding of how to overcome some of these areas that are hard right now. So let's jump in. So many of you, or perhaps all of you, may know that we're going to be using the Myers-Briggs Framework to talk about communication and communication difference, because sometimes I find it super hard just to say, oh, they're different than me. Like, what do I do about that? But if we have a framework for understanding the differences, it makes it really hard. It makes it much easier, actually. And so what we're talking about today is the innate tendencies in the way that you use your mind. Now, I want to pause here for a quick second and just do a quick check-in and a quick little poll here. How many of you are already familiar with Myers-Briggs and you already know your type? Just take a sec to type in a yes or no. That just gives me kind of a benchmark of how knowledgeable everybody is. And you don't have to be. It's actually perfectly fine. But just let us know how familiar you are already with your type, if that's true for you. Okay, so we actually have a pretty good split here. In fact, the majority of you already know your type. So this will be great because we can go in a little bit deeper. All right, excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So let's dive in here. So what I want to do is to start by having you do a little exercise, and hopefully you're all either at your homes or near a desk, and if you're driving, then do not do this exercise. So pick up a pen or pencil, and on any piece of paper near you, just sign your name. And then when you're done, switch to the other hand and sign your name again. Now, for most people that I do this exercise with, the things that come up for them, in fact, you can use the chat box to write this for yourself. You know, how was it with your dominant hand? It was easy. It was usually a no-brainer. Like I didn't even have to think about it. And with your non-dominant hand, you know, I did have somebody say it was impossible, which is actually not true, but just really that it was much more difficult and challenging. It took more time. It took more focus. But the point is, you still can do it. And so what I want you to do is to take away, that's how we're going to be looking at all these different preferences, is that there's going to be one way that's just like signing with your dominant hand. And then there's going to be a different preference that you can still do it, but it's going to feel a little awkward. It's going to feel more like signing your name with your non-dominant hand. So let me refresh for those of you that might not be aware what the 4 different categories for Myers-Briggs are, and we'll go into a little bit more detail on these. So first we'll be talking about how you gain your mental energy. Next, we're going to be looking at how you gather information, and once you have that, what do you do with it? And last, how is your approach to life and work? And through the lens of each one of these categories, we're going to be talking about some of the common challenges that come up in the workplace and the common challenges that come up as we're all working virtually. So the first piece is, how do you recharge your mental energy? And for those of you who are familiar, you know this already, but what I'm going to do is to take a minute to go through the 2 different preferences in this area. The first one is extraversion or extrovert, and the next one, the alternate preference, is introversion. And so those of you that have an extroverted preference, you are energized mentally by the outer world, by people, by being outdoors, in activity. Now, a lot of people say, oh, if they're an extrovert, they're the life of the party, or they're really loud, or, you know, and some of those elements might be true, but this is not about social gregariousness. It's more around how do you recharge your mental energy. And the same thing with introversion. This is more that you're recharging through downtime, through processing, through a little bit more solo time. It does not mean that you're shy. That's kind of a different piece. It may mean that you're slightly more private because that's how you gain your mental energy. So let me give you a few characteristics of the extroversion, and you can be listening to see if these fit you. So those of you who are extroverted, the way you process or communicate is more so verbally. So you may, when we were in offices, walk into somebody's office and say, hey, do you have a minute? You may pick up the phone. And the model is to talk, think, talk, because you're working out ideas by talking. They might be kind of half-baked in the beginning, but you really learn best when you have the opportunity to discuss and collaborate with others. A lot of extroverts, if it's in their head, it's out of their mouth. So they may think out loud. They may blurt out answers sometimes. And they really do prefer to have busier places to work because there's some energy in this for them. Now, on the introverted side, we have things that your mental energy is processed a little differently. So instead of verbal, you're preferring to do things more in writing, by email, maybe text, because it's giving you a moment to sort of pause and think, what do I want to say? You also have the ability, or the preference, I should say, to work out your ideas by thinking. So the model is more think, talk, think. And therefore, you learn best when you have a little bit more time to process, when you can think through things. And this is definitely a characteristic for most all introverts that I know, is that you really don't like to be called out. So if you're in a big meeting, being able to think about what your answers are and ideally know what's being expected of you beforehand is definitely something that is important for you to bring your best ideas. And so, of course, because you process internally, having quieter places to work is better for you. That's more mentally energizing. So let's kind of move on. Here's a quick breakdown of how the different preferences are divided. And as you can see from these statistics, it's pretty much extroverted and introverted. It's split population-wise pretty evenly, almost 50-50. Slightly more males than females have an introverted and vice versa, but by and large, it's pretty equal. And so let me pause here and we'll do a quick check-in based on this quick update that I shared with you. And maybe you already know, do you think that you're a little bit more extroverted or more introverted in terms of how you regenerate your mental energy? Looks like we might be getting some more answers in here. All right, so it looks like a few more of you, about 66%, are more introverted. Okay, so this is great. This actually is super helpful for me because it allows me to speak to those points. So thank you for taking the time to put in your thoughts. So let's talk for a second about some of the barriers, some of the communication barriers. So if you have an extroverted preference, so that 34% of you on the line, make sure that you're giving your introverted peers and colleagues time to think before they give feedback, and even some pause afterwards. So don't be demanding answers immediately. And ideally, even if we're working virtually, if you have the ability to send an agenda beforehand, or at least tell people, hey, Susan, this is what we're going to be needing of you, then you're allowing your peers to get their best. So sometimes that conflict occurs because you might be putting an introvert on the spot and they feel uncomfortable and they may distance or withdraw from the meeting or hide their video and just basically disengage. So we don't want that for people to do their best work. Another tip here for you introverts is just to allow time for your extroverted peers to talk and work through problems collaboratively. Because for them, this working from home, this virtual scenario can be really tough. It's tough because they normally gain their mental energy by being in the office, by collaborating, by talking. And the way that we have to work virtually is harder. So when they are on video or on the phone, they're going to want some time to be able to just think through, talk through their responses. And so giving them the luxury of being able to do that is great. Now, I will say that there's a limit there. Some extroverts can actually kind of consume the whole meeting, and we don't want that. So there may be boundaries. But just having a recognition that some people, especially those that are extroverted, need to be able to have time to work through their thoughts. The overall takeaway on this, whether you're introverted or extroverted, is just to really get an understanding of where that sweet spot is and where the balance is for you to have your best mental energy. So if you're super extroverted, then really, and you can't get that energy from collaborating, then you may want to spend more to get outside, go for a run, pick up some great activities, even at home or outside of your home. And for you introverts, sometimes all of the videos nonstop can be really draining. And so understanding where that balance is, where you may need to decline a meeting so that you can recharge or have a little break, allows you to show up at your best. So let's keep going here. The next piece is talking about how do you gather information? So we all do this in one of two ways, according to Myers-Briggs. And I will tell you guys before we dive into this, that there's two different preferences. One is more sensing, which is more detail oriented, and one is more intuitive, which is more bigger picture and gut instinct. And absolutely, this one category, like if you guys take nothing else away from this presentation, but this one category, this is the greatest place of communication conflict. In fact, one of the questions that came up I'll address because it has to do exactly with the sensing versus intuition. And here's why. Let me go through some of the characteristics of those of you that have more of that sensing preference. So for you, there's really a desire, kind of in the back of your mind, it's largely around prove it. You may not consciously be aware of this, but you really have a desire to get the data, to get the facts, to get the analysis, to know, look at the specifics in order to shape what you want to do next. Sensing preference people are they're very real, they're really practical, so they're very much more focused on the present moment. And so for those of you who have a preference for sensing, your language may be much more around what is our next step? And so really thinking linearly, like what are we doing first, what are we doing next, and very, very conscious of the here and now, much more present oriented. Another piece for sensing preference is that for them to come up with the big picture, to come up with the plan, to come up with the process out of thin air can actually be something that's kind of difficult. But once they have a plan or have a process, they can execute on it brilliantly as long as they're really clear and they know what's expected. Now, on the other hand, if you have that intuitive preference, then you're going to be much more around what could be, what's possible here. You're going to be taking in the whole big picture and you're going to want to know why we're doing something before you dive into the details of it. You may tend to be a little bit more imaginative. And also another big factor between the two is the intuitive preference is more thinking about the future. Where are we going with this? What's our future direction? What does this tie to our vision? And so they're more focused on the future as opposed to the sensing that's more focused on the present. Intuitive preferences tend to be more theoretical and their brains make connection between things very, very quickly. So if you said to an intuitive, hey, we need to put together that 5-year plan, if you have an intuitive preference, that would kind of be a no-brainer. You'd be like, oh, okay, let me just connect the dots here. Let me put the pieces together. I see how everything is connected and how we need to orchestrate together. So building strategy and thinking bigger picture is very easy for them. And so you can see right off the bat where the conflict can occur, because if one is always asking and wanting the data and the facts before they can move forward, and the other gets a little bored with the facts and details or impatient and wants the bigger picture, right then and there, you have a place for communication frustration. This is a quick little graphic to show the difference between the two. So the sensing preference is much more linear. What's our first step? What's our next step? And the intuitive preference is more like, hey, let me understand the big picture first, and then I will go to the next step. So based on this quick overview, how many of you think that you have more of a sensing preference? You need and want the details, you really want to understand, prove it? Or how many of you think you might have an intuitive, more bigger picture, more kind of a strategic view, understand how things connect together? Okay, so it looks like we have a little bit more on the intuitive side here. So that helps me understand what kinds of questions, what kind of scenarios might be challenges for you. So let's kind of keep going on this. So when we're talking about the barriers here, if you have a presentation to make, and this is very true in where we are right now, whether you were intuitive or sensing, here's a tip. Start with the problem statement first. A lot of sensing preference people will start with the data, and they may have 3 or 4 slides around the specifics and the numbers and the reports and the analysis. But if that's true, you have to understand that probably half of your audience is going to be intuitive. And if you start by diving into the detail, you're going to lose them. And so one of the ways to keep people on the same page is to start by saying, hey, here's our problem statement, or here's what we're trying to solve for. And then you can go into the data and you'll have more patience for those that have the intuitive preference. Additionally, for you intuitives, if you're working with your peers or your boss and you know that they're more detail oriented, they're more sensing preference, and that might frustrate you because you may not want to dive into the detail, you can collaborate and leverage their superpower by incorporating their ability to really look at the data in a new way to validate, to help you validate your points. And so if you have a sensing preference, you can work with your intuitive peers to help build the bigger picture, to build the strategy. And so the point here isn't that you're looking at your opposite peer who thinks differently and are frustrated with them because they're not thinking the same way that you are, but you have an awareness and appreciation for the differences so that you could collaborate together. And when you can come at a conflict from a place of understanding and even compassion, it really goes a long way in terms of breaking down those barriers. And then lastly, for you intuitives, you may have a tendency to connect the dots and connect storytelling. So if somebody asks you a straight question, you may launch into a story, but be aware of your tendency to do that, because it can be frustrating to sensors if they don't feel like you're answering the question. So yet that might be another way of breaking through a potential frustration, because we want you to be able to stay with them in the moment and not go to kind of future stories or future answers. So let's kind of keep going. The third category is around how you make decisions. And so this is also a place of frustration that come up, because there are two different preferences here. One is a little bit more for thinking, which is more logic, more criteria, and the other is a little bit more around feeling, and that is more values oriented. And I'll tell you guys that these two words are kind of crummy, because thinking people feel and feeling people think. They probably should be better described as logic and values. So let me describe what I mean by that. For those of you that have that thinking preference, you're more guided by cause and effect, by the logic of the situation, by seeking the truth, understanding why, really having impartial criteria and focusing on the task. You may be more critical and seeing, hey, it would be easy for you to spot the flaws in things. Now, if you have that feeling or values-oriented preference, you're coming at decisions from a different angle. You're coming at decisions more guided by what you believe is important, by your personal values. You're going to want to seek others' point of view on things before you make a decision. And really, you really want to seek harmony. So sometimes the debate in meetings can be challenging and frustrating for you, because you just like, can't we all get along here? You're really friendly in terms of sharing personal stories and circumstances, and you're going to come at a situation by first acknowledging what's good about it. That's just the way you're oriented. And by and large, very focused on the relationship first and foremost. And so with that, here's a quick breakdown and a tip to know, because we're all working with mixed gender. Overall, population-wise, it's pretty evenly split. I'd say, right down the middle, 40 to 50, or, 55, you could say, is pretty evenly between thinking and feeling. However, what you notice is that there are many more males than females that have that thinking preference. And if I were to summarize, I'd say about 2/3 of men have thinking and 1/3 of women, and about 2/3 of women have a feeling preference and 1/3 of men. So that's just something to keep in mind, because if you are a woman with a thinking preference working with a lot of women, then this can be an area of hardship or conflict for you. So based on this quick overview, do you guys feel like you have more of a preference for thinking, you're more direct, more logical criteria, or more towards feeling? You're more values oriented, really focused on the relationship and how things are done. Okay, well, we have pretty close split. So 36 as thinking and 64 for feeling. So that would make sense. I don't know what the gender mix of our audience is today, but especially if we have more women on the line, then that would fit right in with the ratios. So let's go to the fourth and final piece here. So when we're talking about the let's actually talk about the barriers first. So some of the conflicts that can occur is that there can be, sometimes the feeling preferences will take things personally because their thinking peers can be very forthright, very direct. But if you have that feeling preference, one of the tips here is to still lean in and be direct. This might be slightly uncomfortable for you, but you need to speak your mind and be direct so that the thinkers can hear you. They can acknowledge you. For you feeling preference, you may also need to speak your boundaries. So if you have a peer that's being overly direct or confrontational, then you may need to say, hey, no, that was a little bit across the line. I need you to listen to my opinion here. And on the flip side of that, try not to take things personally, because the thinking preferences aren't trying to hurt anyone's feelings. They're just saying it as they believe. They're just being direct, and that's just how they are. So if you don't take it personally, it can also minimize some of the conflict. And for those of you who have a thinking preference, and this came up in one of the questions, one of the tips is to acknowledge versus analyze your feeling coworkers, their feelings, their values, and opinions. And so you may have a very strong opinion, but if you take a moment to just really acknowledge, hey, I hear you. I can see that you're pretty emotional about that, or that's really frustrating for you, or what do you value about this? Just hearing them will really go a long way. And you certainly will be able to still get your point across, but you'll build trust in the process. So let's talk quickly about the approach to life. So there's two different preferences on this. One is what's called judging, and this does not mean you're judgmental. It just means I like to think of it more like a judge in a courtroom. You like structure, order, want to have things in their place. Versus perceiving, that is more flexible, wants a little more spontaneity, wants to explore options. And so the judging preference, like I mentioned, more orderly, structured. That's how you do your best work. You may want to make decisions and move on. And you really like to have clear expectations. Have things be more organized and efficient and planned. Versus that perceiving preference is the way you like to roll, whether it's at life or work, is a little bit more space, a little bit more flexibility. You want to explore all the options before making a decision. And so making those last minute decisions are actually energizing, and you need a deadline, or else sometimes the deadline, the things can kind of get pressed out if you don't have a deadline. But having that open opportunity to discuss and talk about things versus being forced to make immediate decisions is much better for you, because having those immediate decisions can be anxiety provoking. This is a quick graphic that just shows how the two brains are oriented. The judging preference is going to have, they know when the deadline is, there's milestones, you have your output, you're giving your status reports, and everything is very sequenced. Now the perceiving preference is going to be a little different. You know what the deadline is, and it's rolling around and the ideas are in the back of your head, but not a lot you might not see a lot of output until there's this whoosh of activity right before the deadline. And so that is a little bit more how the two brains operate. So how many of you feel, based on that overview, that you might have more of a structured judging preference in the way you like to do your work, as compared to those of you on the line who may think, I like a little more flexibility. I want to know what my options are. I like to explore that. Okay, so we look like we have a little bit more, the 64% versus 36%, that you like to have things structured. So good to know. So let's go to some of the common barriers that often come up. So for those of you, that 36% who are perceivers, one of the tips here to overcome some of the communication barriers is to know when to stop exploring and need to make decisions. So if you're working, whether it's over video or not, and you keep wanting to get more ideas and more input and more information, that can be frustrating to your peers, and that can cause communication friction. And so being okay with just saying, okay, I'm going to put a stake in the ground and this is where we want to move on, can be very helpful. for those of you that have that judging preference, collaborating with your team members. So for those of you who may have team members who have that perceiving preference, it seems like they're always changing their mind, or it seems like they're not honoring deadlines. This can be a thing too. Collaborating and talking with them to set a realistic deadline will be very helpful, because a perceiver can sniff out a fake or a padded deadline in a second. And those of you who are perceivers know what I'm talking about. Also, either way, sending the agenda and the timelines and the expectations ahead of time is going to be great for both people. So being aware of this can be really helpful as well. And so especially when we have a limited amount of time, we have some challenges in terms of communication because we're not all in the room together. So knowing what's expected and how we can clip through meeting conversations and get to an end result is very helpful. I want to give you guys a couple quick tips before we wrap up here and move on to Q&A. If you're not entirely certain, there's an awesome website that's called 16personalities.com. And they've kept a tally of how many assessments. It's free. And as of, I think, Wednesday, when I pulled this number, you can see there's 271 million, almost 794, 173 assessments that have been taken. So they've got a ton of data. And this is an amazing website that's free and really, really informative if you want to dive a little deeper, not only to understand yourself, but to explore and to look at some of the others, because that's a lot of what we're talking about today, is using this information so that you can understand your peers and even your boss a little better. So this is a great quote just to wrap things up here. And it's really so poignant right now, even especially. Isabel Myers said, you know, a difference at time can produce an outright conflict between the opposite points of view. And when this happens, these partners have a choice. One or both can assume it's wrong to be different, and they can be indignant about it. And doing so, though, diminishes the other person, the partner. Or they can assume that it's wrong of themselves to be different and thus be depressed or self-diminished. But the way that I invite you all to take this information is to use it as a tool, a framework, so that you can acknowledge that each of you is justifiably and interestingly different from each other and be amused. So here are a few quick next steps that I invite you to think about, and maybe not all of them would be relevant, but to take this information and do your best to assess your boss or your coworkers and see if you can kind of suss out to your best ability what their preferences are and how that might be different than yours. Certainly use this information I'm sharing today. Go online and research Myers-Briggs. There is so much information. Or go to the 16personalities.com website to really get a better understanding of what your peers' language might be. Because if you know that, then you can shift how you communicate so that they can understand you and thus minimize those conflict and friction areas. Also, if there's one particular person or one particular challenge, pick one area and just try a new approach or a tactic based on this information I've shared today. Try it for a week and then notice and evaluate, did it help? Was there a success there? Did you break through that barrier? And last but not least, if there's one area where you continually find yourself frustrated or struggling, one of the answers can either be, ask for time with your boss or your peer to talk about this. But I'll tell you also, there may be just an area of being patient with yourself. It is hard to be working virtually all the time right now. And we may be frustrated just because of this format in which that we are being required to work. I wanted to take a quick moment just to talk about a special offer that I'm offering just to the Simplicity consulting community. And I just want you to know what I stand for. In our company motto and what we believe in is really about empowering. It's about empowering you to realize your potential, to elevate your leadership, to really create that meaningful level of impact in a deeply fulfilling career. And that is what I am all about. And so for those of you that this resonated, or maybe you have some questions, or really if you want to understand a little more or have a conversation about how you can grow as a consultant, and maybe that's in your career, maybe it's with your contracts, and maybe it's even how can I grow in terms of the rate that I'm asking for, then jump over to this URL and find a time on my calendar and let's talk. So that is what I would definitely like to offer to all of you. So let me pause there. That is really it. And feel free to follow up with me with that tiny URL, Julie Schaller. I'm happy to kind of take this to the next step and talk a little bit more for those that's helpful to.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. And thanks everybody for sticking with us, and have a great day, great weekend.